Welcome to Logic Over Faith. When you look at religion carefully, one of the things that always stands out is how often it contradicts itself. These contradictions are not small slip-ups. They are sometimes laughably obvious. And yet, billions of people build their entire worldview around these ideas without ever stopping to ask how both claims can be true at the same time. Today, we are going to look at some of the funniest contradictions in religious thought. These contradictions are so strange and illogical that if they were written in any other kind of book, people would probably laugh them off immediately. But because they are stamped with the label of religion, many just nod along as if it all makes perfect sense. Let's start with a very basic one. Many religions describe God as being all-loving and full of mercy. At the same time, those same religions describe eternal punishment for people who do not follow the right rituals or believe in the right version of the story. Think about how funny that is. On the one hand, God loves you more than anything, but on the other hand, if you make the wrong choice, this same God will burn you in hell forever. Imagine a parent saying to a child, "I love you unconditionally, but if you don't obey me, I will lock you in a basement full of fire for eternity." No one would call that love, they would call it abuse. Yet billions believe this contradiction is perfectly normal because it comes packaged under the title of religion. Another contradiction comes from the claim that God created everything and knows everything. If God knows everything, then he must have known before creating humans that they would sin, disobey, and fall short. He would also know exactly who ends up in heaven and who ends up in hell. But at the same time, religions say humans have free will and must be tested. If God already knows the outcome, then what is the point of a test? It is like a teacher giving a test to students while already knowing every single answer they will give. In fact, it would be like grading them before the test even began. The contradiction here is clear. Either God knows everything and the test is pointless, or humans have real freedom and God does not know the outcome. You cannot have both, but religions confidently claim both as true, which makes it one of the funniest contradictions of all. A very famous contradiction appears in the idea of God being unchanging and eternal while also changing his mind constantly. Think about the countless times in holy books where God regrets, gets angry, or decides to punish a group of people only to forgive them later. If God is all-knowing and perfect, then why regret anything at all? Regret only exists when someone realizes they made a mistake. If God never makes mistakes, then there should never be regret. Yet many scriptures describe him regretting his decisions, such as creating humanity in the first place, or choosing to destroy them with a flood, then later promising not to do it again. These are actions that make sense for flawed human beings, not for a perfect, all-knowing God. The contradiction is striking. A perfect God who never changes is somehow changing all the time. One of the funniest contradictions comes from the idea of prayer. Believers are told to pray to God to ask for help. But if God already has a perfect plan, why would prayer matter? If he has already decided everything, then changing his plan because someone prayed would mean it was not perfect to begin with. On the other hand, if prayer has no effect, then why pray at all? Religious people often end up explaining this contradiction by saying, prayer is not about changing God, but about changing you. But that is not how prayer is presented in their own scriptures or traditions. People pray for rain, for healing, for success in exams, for winning the lottery. If God changes his mind because someone begged enough, that makes him more like a king who can be persuaded by flattery rather than a perfect being with an unchanging plan. The whole idea of prayer, when combined with the idea of God's perfection, is one giant contradiction that no one ever really wants to admit. Now let's look at a contradiction about morality. Religions claim that morality comes from God. At the same time, they also claim that God is above morality. This is hilarious when you think about it. If morality comes from God, then he must follow his own rules. But when God does something that humans would consider evil, like killing children in a flood or commanding wars, believers immediately say, well, God's morality is different from ours. But if his morality is different, then why should humans try to follow it? If killing is wrong, it should be wrong for everyone, including God. If killing can be right for God, then there is no universal morality. The contradiction here is that morality is both absolute and relative at the same time depending on the situation. That is why when you ask religious people whether God can lie, they get stuck. Some say he cannot lie because that would make him imperfect. Others say he can lie if he wants to, but then how can you ever trust anything he supposedly said? Another contradiction comes from the idea that God is everywhere and cannot be limited by time or space, yet he lives in heaven or in a temple or inside a specific book. If God is truly everywhere, then it makes no sense to point upward when you pray or to say he is inside a holy place more than anywhere else. People build massive temples, mosques, and churches, spending millions just to house God. But if he is everywhere, then a God who lives in a golden palace is no more present there than in a trash bin. The contradiction is almost comical. Either God is everywhere equally, or he is in a special place. You cannot have both. The contradictions get even funnier when you examine the idea of perfection. Religions say that God is perfect and his creation is perfect. But when you look around, nothing is perfect. Human bodies are full of flaws. We get sick, we age, we die. The earth is full of natural disasters, earthquakes, and diseases that wipe out millions of people. When asked why creation looks so flawed, believers say it is because of human sin. But wait, if God is perfect and knew everything, then why would he create humans that he knew would ruin everything? Either the creation was not perfect to begin with, or the creator is not perfect. It is one of those contradictions that people avoid thinking about too much because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Another funny contradiction is about God's visibility. Some texts say no one can ever see God because he is beyond human vision. At the same time, other passages describe people seeing God face to face, wrestling with him, or speaking to him directly. For example, in one story, Moses sees God, while in another story, the same book says no one can see God and live. Which one is it? Can humans see him or not? Imagine a storyteller saying in one chapter that the monster is invisible, and then in another chapter describing people seeing its glowing eyes. That would be considered poor writing in a novel. Yet in religion, it is considered holy mystery. One of my favorites is the contradiction about God's justice and mercy. Religion says God is perfectly just, meaning he gives everyone exactly what they deserve. At the same time, God is perfectly merciful, meaning he forgives people even if they do not deserve it. How can both be true at the same time? If God forgives a murderer out of mercy, then justice is not served. If he insists on perfect justice, then mercy cannot exist. This contradiction is especially funny because preachers often celebrate both qualities in the same sermon without realizing they cancel each other out. It would be like saying a judge always gives criminals the punishment they deserve, except when he decides not to because he feels merciful that day. That is not perfection. That is inconsistency. Finally, let's look at the contradiction in the idea of faith itself. Religion tells people to have faith without evidence, to trust God blindly. At the same time, religious texts are full of stories where people believed only after seeing miracles. If faith without evidence is the highest virtue, then why does God constantly provide evidence in the form of miracles, visions, and signs? And why are those miracles conveniently absent in the modern world where cameras could record them? The contradiction is that faith is both supposed to be without evidence and yet always backed by ancient stories of evidence. These contradictions are not small details. They go right to the heart of religious belief. And when you line them up one after the other, they become almost comical. Imagine if any other human institution made claims this contradictory. If a doctor told you, you are both perfectly healthy and fatally sick at the same time, you would laugh in his face. If a lawyer said, this law always applies except when it does not, you would never take him seriously. But when religion makes the same kind of contradictory claims, people are told to accept it as mystery, as something beyond human understanding. And that is where the humor really lies. It is not just that these contradictions exist. It is that people treat them as if they are profound truths rather than obvious mistakes. It is as if a magician pulled a rabbit out of an empty hat, and instead of saying, that's a trick, people said, that is the deepest truth of life. When you take a step back and really think about these contradictions, What makes them so funny is not just the clash of ideas, but the way people live with them as if they are not contradictions at all. It is like watching someone insist that 2 plus 2 equals both 4 and 5 depending on the day, and then proudly defending that position as wisdom. Let us expand on some of these contradictions even more, because the details make them even harder to ignore. Take the contradiction about God's love and eternal punishment. If a human being acted in this way, we would never call it love. Imagine a father telling his daughter that he loves her more than anything in the world. But if she ever disagrees with him or chooses a different path, he will set her on fire forever. No court would call that love. It would be considered psychotic. Yet billions are taught to see this as the highest form of love. The contradiction here is amplified when you notice how often preachers emphasize unconditional love. The word unconditional means without conditions, but in religion the love of God always comes with conditions. Believe in me, worship me, obey me, or face eternal punishment. That is not unconditional love. It is the opposite. It is the kind of love an abuser uses to control his victim. People would laugh if they saw a movie villain act this way and still claim to be loving. Yet in religion, it is celebrated as divine. The contradiction about free will and God's knowledge gets even funnier when you bring in real-life examples. Think of a chess grandmaster playing against a complete beginner. The grandmaster knows every possible move the beginner can make and knows the outcome of the game long before it is finished. The beginner may feel like he has free will, but in reality, the grandmaster already controls the game. Now imagine God, who supposedly knows not just every move, but the outcome of every life before it even begins. That makes the so-called test of life nothing more than theater. The idea of testing humanity when the answer is already known is like a teacher writing both the question and the answer key, giving the students the test, and then acting surprised when some fail. The contradiction is so obvious that when people are pushed on it, they usually retreat into saying, God's ways are beyond our understanding, but that is just another way of saying, yes, it makes no sense, but stop thinking about it. The contradiction about God being perfect yet regretful is another one that grows stranger the more you think about it. Imagine the CEO of a company making a decision to launch a new product, then immediately saying he regrets the decision, then changing his mind again later. If a CEO did that, shareholders would fire him for incompetence. Yet when God is described this way, it is treated as divine wisdom. How can perfection regret? Regret requires lack of foresight. If you knew what was going to happen, you would never regret. Yet religious texts describe God regretting creating humanity, regretting choosing certain kings, regretting decisions that led to disaster. It is the behavior of a human being stumbling through mistakes, not of a perfect being with eternal knowledge. The contradiction is not just funny, but actually undermines the very idea of perfection. Prayer is perhaps one of the most revealing contradictions because everyone has personal experience with it. Believers pray for health, for jobs, for money, for relationships, for victory in sports. Yet outcomes often do not change. People still get sick, lose jobs, or suffer heartbreak no matter how much they pray. When prayer does not work, believers say it was not God's will. When prayer seems to work, they say God answered. That means prayer is always considered successful no matter the outcome. If you pray for rain and it rains, God listened. If you pray for rain and it does not rain, then God had a better plan. In either case, prayer never fails because the definition of failure is removed. The contradiction here is glaring. Prayer is supposed to be communication with God that changes things, but at the same time, it is not supposed to change anything because God's plan is perfect. That is like calling customer service where the operator promises to listen to your complaints but also says nothing will ever change regardless of what you say. The morality contradiction gets even funnier when you look at specific stories. In many religious texts, God commands not to kill, but then commands wars and massacres. He tells people lying is wrong, but then sends deceiving spirits or causes confusion to mislead enemies. He commands honesty, yet blesses people who lie for him. In one story, a prostitute lies to protect spies and is praised for it. In another story, entire nations are slaughtered under God's command, but the commandment still says, "Thou shalt not kill." The contradiction is so blatant that most people would notice it immediately if they read the texts without being told in advance that they were holy. It is like a parent telling a child never to steal, then applauding when the child steals for the family's benefit. The standard shifts depending on convenience, and yet believers are told this represents absolute morality. The contradiction about God being everywhere yet located in one special place also comes with real-life examples. People will say God is present in their hearts, but at the same time, they will travel thousands of miles to pray at a special temple or a holy city because they believe God is more present there. How can someone who is everywhere be more present in one spot? If God is everywhere, then praying in your bathroom should be just as effective as praying in a golden palace. Yet religious traditions are built on the idea that some places are holier than others. Pilgrimages, holy cities, sacred rivers, all of them rely on the contradiction that God is simultaneously everywhere and yet tied to specific geography. If God really transcends space, why would location matter at all? The idea of a perfect creation that is clearly not perfect is another contradiction we all live with. Believers often say, look at the beauty of nature, look at the complexity of life, it is all perfect. But then when disasters strike, they immediately blame human sin. Earthquakes, floods, viruses, cancer, these are explained away as punishment or as a result of human failure. But wait, if nature is designed by God, then natural disasters are part of His design. If the human body is perfect, why do babies die of genetic diseases before they can even walk? To claim perfection while constantly excusing flaws is one of the funniest contradictions of all. It is like a car company calling its new car flawless and then giving customers a manual full of troubleshooting guides because the car breaks down constantly. The contradiction about justice and mercy can be illustrated by a modern courtroom. Imagine a judge who tells everyone he is perfectly just. A thief is brought before him, and the law says he must serve 5 years in prison. But the judge decides to let him go free because he feels merciful today. That may be kind, but it is not justice. Now imagine the next day, another thief is brought before him, and the judge gives the full sentence because today he feels like being just. The system would collapse. Justice means fairness and consistency, not randomness. If God is perfectly just, then mercy that cancels justice cannot exist. If God is perfectly merciful, then justice that ignores mercy cannot exist. Yet religion insists on holding both ideas at the same time, as if two opposites can magically become true when placed together. Finally, the contradiction of faith itself reveals the biggest irony. People are told to believe without evidence, and that faith is stronger when it requires no proof. Yet entire religious traditions are based on stories of miracles that are supposed to be proofs. Believers point to these miracles as evidence of God's existence, but at the same time tell skeptics that faith should not need evidence. Which is it? If miracles are necessary, then faith is not enough. If faith is enough, then miracles are unnecessary. The contradiction is exposed even more today when cameras and science exist. Miracles were supposedly common in the past, with seas parting, food falling from the sky, and the dead rising. Yet in the modern age, miracles have conveniently disappeared. People are told to have faith without proof, while being reminded constantly of old stories that supposedly serve as proof. When you line up all these contradictions, they become almost like a comedy sketch. Imagine a character in a sitcom who constantly contradicts himself, saying one thing in the morning and the opposite at night, and everyone around him just nods and claps. That is how religions operate. The contradictions are obvious, but the culture of faith demands people accept them as deep truths. In reality, they are the kind of illogical claims that would never survive in any other area of life. So the next time someone tells you religion is the foundation of truth, remember the top 10 contradictions we have talked about. Remember how funny it is that people call contradictions wisdom and call inconsistencies mysteries. And remember that if the same contradictions appeared in any other area of life, they would be dismissed immediately. It is only in religion that people are told to stop thinking, accept both sides of the contradiction, and call it faith.